At 42, Henry Louis was a man who seemingly had everything. A sprawling estate in the heart of the city, luxury cars worth more than most people's lifetime earnings, and a reputation that commanded respect in every boardroom he entered. His name was synonymous with power and wealth, but despite all his success, there was one thing missing: an heir. Henry had spent decades meticulously building his empire, making calculated decisions that ensured his financial dominance. Yet, as he sat alone in his penthouse suite overlooking the city skyline, he realized that none of it mattered if he had no one to pass it on to. Money could buy almost anything, but it hadn't given him a family, a legacy that would outlive him. Love, in Henry's mind, was an illusion. He had tried marriage, twice, in fact, and both times, it had ended in bitter disappointment. His first wife had loved his wealth more than him, and his second had resented his obsession with work. He had learned the hard way that emotions were unreliable, messy, and ultimately, a liability. But a child was different. A child wasn't about emotions, it was about continuity. About ensuring that the name Henry Louis would live on for generations to come. And unlike love, this was something he could control. Marriage was out of the question. He didn't want the entanglements, the expectations, or the inevitable heartbreak. What he needed was a straightforward, businesslike arrangement, someone who would bear his child with no strings attached. With his resources, Henry knew that finding a willing participant wouldn't be difficult. There were plenty of women who would agree to the right price, but he needed someone who wouldn't complicate things, someone who would understand that this was purely transactional. The next morning, as Henry drove his sleek black sports car through the city, his mind raced with the possibilities. A surrogate agency? Too much paperwork. An arrangement with a socialite? Too many complications. Then, while stopped at a red light near downtown, something caught his eye. A young woman sat on the sidewalk, her back against a brick wall, sketching on a piece of crumpled paper. Her brown hair was tangled, her clothes worn and faded, but there was something striking about her, something that made Henry take a second look. She seemed utterly absorbed in her drawing, oblivious to the rush of people passing her by. The light turned green. Henry hesitated for half a second, then pressed the gas pedal and sped away. But several blocks later, an unsettling thought nagged at him. Who sits on a city sidewalk drawing as if nothing else exists? He pulled into a parking lot, drumming his fingers against the leather steering wheel. This is ridiculous, he muttered. And yet, something in his gut told him to turn back. Henry Louis was not a man prone to hesitation. He had built his empire by making quick, calculated decisions, never second-guessing himself. Yet, as he sat in his car, gripping the leather steering wheel, something about that young woman on the sidewalk gnawed at him. Against his usual instincts, he turned around. She was still there, crouched near the wall, completely absorbed in her drawing. Up close, she looked even thinner than he had first noticed, her frame barely filling the oversized hoodie she wore. Her fingers were smudged with charcoal, her jeans torn, not in a fashionable way, but from sheer wear and tear. Henry rolled down his window and spoke, his tone as direct as ever. "Hey! Come here." The woman looked up, startled. Her blue eyes, striking against the grime on her face, narrowed in suspicion. She hesitated, then shook her head. "I'm not interested," she said flatly, turning back to her drawing. Henry frowned. He wasn't used to people refusing him. "I'm not asking," he said, more firmly. "I just want to talk." She let out a dry, humorless laugh. "Yeah, I bet you do." Her guardedness intrigued him. Most people in her situation would have jumped at the opportunity to get in a car like his, a sleek, black luxury sedan that practically screamed money. But she wasn't most people. "Get in," he ordered. "I don't have all day." The young woman studied him carefully. He could see the hesitation in her posture, the calculation. She was weighing her options, trying to decide if stepping into a stranger's car was worth the risk. Finally, with a resigned sigh, she stood up, brushed the dust off her jeans, and opened the door. As she settled into the passenger seat, she cast him another wary glance. "So, what do you want?" Henry didn't answer right away. He drove toward a quiet cafe on the outskirts of downtown, away from the bustling lunch crowds. Only when they were seated at a small booth in the back did he finally speak. "What's your name?" he asked. "Layla Parker," she said, crossing her arms. "Why does it matter?" Henry ignored the hostility in her tone. "Because I need to know who I'm dealing with." Layla smirked. "And who exactly are you, Mr. Suit and Tie?" "Henry Lewis." He didn't bother explaining further. His name was well known enough. She raised an eyebrow. "Should I be impressed?" Henry leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on the table. "That depends." "On what?" "On whether or not you want your life to change." Layla blinked, her expression shifting from sarcasm to caution. "What's that supposed to mean?" "I want to make you an offer," he said. "Something that could change your circumstances permanently." Layla scoffed. "Let me guess, you want me to be your assistant? A housekeeper?" "No," Henry said coolly. Then he dropped the bombshell. "I want you to have my child." Layla stared at Henry as if he had just spoken a foreign language. She let out a short laugh, shaking her head in disbelief. "You're joking, right?" she said, crossing her arms. Henry didn't flinch. "No. I'm completely serious." Layla studied him, searching for any hint of deception. But his expression remained unreadable, calm, calculated, and completely in control. "This is insane," she muttered. "Who walks up to a total stranger and offers them something like that?" "The kind of man who knows what he wants," Henry replied smoothly. "And who doesn't waste time." Layla scoffed, leaning back in her chair. "Yeah, well, I hate to break it to you, but women aren't vending machines. You can't just insert a few $100 bills and get a baby in return." Henry didn't react to the sarcasm. Instead, he reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He slid it across the table. "This is a contract," he said. "It lays out everything in black and white. No complications. No emotional ties. You carry the child, and when it's over, you walk away with enough money to start over, comfortably." Layla hesitated before picking up the document. Her fingers trembled slightly as she unfolded it. She skimmed through the text, her mind racing. The terms were clear: housing, medical care, financial security for the next 9 months. And, at the end, a payout that was more than she had ever seen in her life. For a woman who had spent the last 2 years sleeping on park benches and relying on soup kitchens, it was an almost impossible offer to refuse. Almost. "And then what?" she asked, her voice quieter now. "What happens after the baby is born?" Henry leaned back in his chair, his expression unwavering. "You'll receive your final payment, and you'll be free to do whatever you want. No obligations. No strings attached." Layla swallowed hard. "And what about the child?" Henry's jaw tightened slightly, but his voice remained steady. "The child will be mine. You'll have no legal claim, no parental rights. That's the deal." Layla looked down at the paper again. A deal. That's what this was, a transaction, plain and simple. But was she willing to go through with it? "I need time to think," she finally said. Henry nodded as if he had expected that response. "You have 24 hours. She blinked. "That's it?" "I don't like to wait," he said simply. Then, standing, he tossed a few crisp bills on the table to cover the untouched coffee in front of them. "If I don't hear from you by tomorrow night, I'll assume you're not interested." With that, he turned and walked out of the cafe, leaving Layla sitting there, staring at the contract that could change her life forever. Layla sat in the cafe long after Henry had left, staring at the contract in front of her. The words on the page blurred together as her mind raced. This was more money than she had ever dreamed of, more than enough to escape the cold sidewalks, the uncertainty of where her next meal would come from, the feeling of being invisible to the world. But at what cost? The idea of carrying a child, only to walk away when it was over, made her stomach churn. Could she really do that? Could she bring a life into the world and then disappear from it as if she had never existed? She folded the paper carefully and stuffed it into the pocket of her worn-out jeans. She needed time to think, but time was the one thing she didn't have. Henry had given her just 24 hours to decide. That night, she walked back to the park where she usually slept. The air was crisp, the wind cutting through the thin fabric of her hoodie. She curled up on a bench, pulling her knees to her chest for warmth. Above her, the stars shone brightly against the dark sky, indifferent to the struggle of the people below. She thought about the last 2 years, how quickly life had unraveled after she lost her job, how impossible it had been to get back on her feet once she had fallen. She had tried to find work, but no one wanted to hire someone without an address. She had tried shelters, but they were crowded, unsafe, and filled with people who had long given up hope. And now, here was Henry Lewis, offering her an escape. Offering her a way to start over. Her mother used to say that opportunities only knock once. But this didn't feel like an opportunity, it felt like a trap. By morning, her decision still wasn't clear. She walked to a small diner, counting the few crumpled bills in her pocket before ordering a cup of coffee. The warmth spread through her fingers as she held the mug, trying to shake off the chill from the night before. As she sipped the bitter liquid, she pulled the contract out again, reading each line carefully. The conditions were strict but straightforward. 9 months of security, followed by financial freedom. No obligations, no further contact. It was a business transaction, nothing more. But could she separate herself from the emotions that would come with it? She thought about Henry, his cold demeanor, his sharp words. He wasn't offering love or companionship. He was offering control, wrapped in the promise of a better life. Was that enough? The sun was beginning to rise when she finally made her way toward the towering glass building where Henry's office was located. She stepped into the sleek lobby, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't know if she was making the right decision. But she did know one thing. She couldn't keep living like this. Taking a deep breath, she walked to the receptionist's desk and spoke 2 words that would change everything. "I accept." Layla sat in the plush leather chair of Henry's office, the contrast between her worn-out clothes and the luxurious surroundings making her feel like an outsider. The walls were lined with bookshelves filled with hardbound volumes, and a massive glass window overlooked the city skyline. The room smelled of polished wood and expensive cologne, everything about it screamed wealth, control, and power. Henry sat across from her, his expression unreadable as he slid the contract across the mahogany desk. A sleek black pen rested on top. "Read it carefully," he said. "I want you to understand exactly what you're agreeing to." Layla hesitated before picking up the paper. She had read it a dozen times already, but this time, it felt heavier in her hands. The agreement was simple: she would carry Henry's child. In exchange, she would be given housing, medical care, and a financial settlement substantial enough to ensure she would never have to sleep on a park bench again. When the child was born, she would walk away. No further involvement. No emotional ties. No turning back. Her fingers trembled slightly as she reached for the pen. "Are you sure about this?" Henry's voice was firm but held the slightest hint of something else, concern, maybe? Layla looked up, meeting his piercing gaze. "I don't have the luxury of second-guessing." Henry nodded, his face unreadable once more. With one final deep breath, Layla pressed the pen to paper and signed her name. Just like that, her life changed. As soon as the ink dried, Henry picked up the contract, scanned it briefly, and then stood. "Stephanie will take care of the arrangements. You'll be moving into my estate this evening." Layla blinked. "Tonight?" "I don't waste time," he said simply. A few minutes later, Henry's assistant, Stephanie, entered the office. She was a polished woman in her late 40s, with a warm but professional demeanor. Unlike Henry, she didn't look at Layla like a business deal, she looked at her like a person. "We have everything set up for you," Stephanie said kindly. "I'll take you there now." Layla followed her out of the building and into a sleek black SUV that felt more comfortable than any place she had been in years. The drive to Henry's estate took nearly an hour. As they left the bustle of the city behind, the scenery changed to rolling hills and towering trees. When they arrived, Layla's breath caught in her throat. The mansion was enormous, a sprawling estate surrounded by meticulously kept gardens and tall iron gates. It looked more like something out of a movie than a place someone actually lived. "This is where you'll be staying," Stephanie said as they pulled up the driveway. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" Layla couldn't answer. She was too busy trying to process the reality of her new life. And deep down, she wondered if she had just made the best decision of her life, or the biggest mistake. Layla stood in the grand foyer of Henry Lewis's estate, feeling like she had stepped into another world. The marble floors gleamed under the glow of a crystal chandelier, and the grand staircase curved gracefully upward, leading to hallways lined with elegant artwork. The house was immaculate, cold, calculated, and overwhelmingly luxurious. "This way," Stephanie said, leading her through the massive space. "I'll show you to your room." Layla followed in silence, feeling the plush carpet beneath her worn-out sneakers. Every step she took seemed to echo through the vast halls, reminding her that she didn't belong here. She had spent the last 2 years sleeping on benches and sidewalks, and now, she was walking through a mansion that looked like something out of a magazine. Stephanie led her to a suite on the second floor. When the door opened, Layla's breath caught in her throat. The room was enormous, with a king-sized bed covered in crisp white linens, a sitting area with velvet chairs, and floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked a perfectly manicured garden. A fireplace flickered softly in the corner, adding warmth to the otherwise sterile atmosphere. "The bathroom is through there," Stephanie gestured toward a door on the right. "And if you need anything, just pick up the house phone. Someone will be available at all times." Layla nodded, still too stunned to speak. Stephanie gave her a small smile. "I know this must feel overwhelming." "That's an understatement," Layla muttered, running her fingers along the soft fabric of the bedspread. Stephanie hesitated before adding, "For what it's worth, you'll be taken care of here. Henry may seem rigid, but he's a man of his word." Layla didn't respond. She wasn't worried about whether Henry would keep his end of the deal. She was more concerned about what this would do to her, living in this house, carrying a child that wouldn't be hers, and then walking away when it was all over. After Stephanie left, Layla walked over to the window, pressing her palm against the cool glass. The garden below was breathtaking, with neatly trimmed hedges and a fountain in the center. But despite its beauty, she felt trapped. As night fell, she wandered downstairs, drawn by the quiet hum of the house. The dining room was empty, but a meal had been left for her on the massive oak table, a plate of roasted chicken, steamed vegetables, and a side of warm bread. It had been years since she had eaten a meal this nice. She sat down hesitantly, glancing around as if someone might stop her. "You should eat," a voice said from the doorway. She turned to see Henry standing there, his hands in his pockets. His expression was unreadable, as always. "I wasn't sure if I was allowed," Layla admitted. Henry's gaze darkened slightly. "You're not a prisoner here, Layla. You'll have everything you need." Layla picked up her fork, but her appetite was gone. She wasn't sure if she was a guest in this house, or just another part of one of Henry Lewis's well-orchestrated plans. The days that followed felt like an adjustment to a life that wasn't hers. Layla had gone from sleeping on sidewalks to living in a mansion where meals were prepared by professional chefs and a full staff maintained every inch of the estate. Everything was available at her fingertips: warm baths, soft sheets, and clothes that actually fit her properly. And yet, she felt like an outsider in her own story. Henry was rarely around. He left early in the morning, dressed in perfectly tailored suits, and returned late at night, his presence barely noticeable except for the occasional quiet footsteps in the hallways. When they did cross paths, their conversations were brief, often consisting of nothing more than a few polite exchanges. But Layla couldn't ignore the underlying tension between them. One evening, she sat in the library, flipping absent-mindedly through the pages of a novel she wasn't really reading. The crackling fireplace offered warmth, but her mind was elsewhere. She was barely a few weeks into the arrangement, yet the reality of what she had agreed to was beginning to weigh on her. Was she really prepared for this? A child wasn't just something you handed over like a signed contract. It was a person. A life. She didn't hear Henry enter the room until he cleared his throat. "You're settling in?" he asked, his voice as even as ever. Layla glanced up, surprised to see him. He rarely initiated conversation. "As much as I can," she admitted. He stepped further into the room, hands in his pockets. "Good." A silence stretched between them, heavier than it should have been. Finally, Layla spoke. "I've been thinking about something." Henry raised an eyebrow. "Go on." She hesitated before continuing. "You say this is just a business deal. No emotions. No attachments." "That's right." Layla nodded, running her fingers along the edge of the book in her lap. "Then tell me, what happens if I change my mind?" For the first time since she met him, she saw something flicker across his face, something uncertain. It was gone as quickly as it appeared. "We have a contract," he said. "Everything is already decided." His words were firm, but Layla wasn't convinced. "You think everything in life can be controlled," she said, watching him closely. "But this? A baby? You can't predict how you'll feel once that child is born." Henry's jaw tightened. "Feelings don't change facts." Layla sighed, standing up and setting the book aside. "Maybe not. But they change people." She walked past him, heading for the door, leaving him alone with his thoughts. For the first time since making the deal, Henry felt something unfamiliar settle in his chest. Doubt. Days turned into weeks, and Layla found herself falling into a routine, one she had never imagined for herself. She had regular doctor's appointments, scheduled meals, and a comfortable place to sleep. The mansion, though grand and intimidating at first, began to feel less like a place she was trapped in and more like a strange kind of home. But it wasn't the house or the luxury that made things feel different. It was Henry. At first, he remained distant, as if determined to keep their arrangement strictly business. But little by little, something changed. He began asking about her appointments, checking in on her well-being, even making sure she had things to keep her occupied. One morning, she found a package outside her room, a sketchbook and a set of high-quality pencils. She ran her fingers over the textured cover, her heart tightening. She hadn't told anyone about her love for drawing, but somehow, Henry had remembered. That night, she found him in his office, scanning through a stack of documents. He barely glanced up when she entered. "The sketchbook," she began, holding it up. "Did you pick this out?" Henry nodded, still focused on his papers. "I figured you might need something to do in your free time." Layla hesitated before stepping further into the room. "You remember that I like to draw?" Now, he did look up. "I remember everything, Layla." She wasn't sure what to say to that. She had assumed Henry was cold, unemotional, a man who saw people as assets rather than individuals. But this was thoughtful. Almost kind. "Thank you," she said softly. He nodded once before turning back to his work, as if the moment had never happened. But Layla felt it, something shifting between them, something unspoken but undeniable. Later that evening, she sat outside on the balcony, sketchbook in her lap, watching the city lights in the distance. She let the pencil glide across the page, sketching the contours of the mansion, the iron gates that enclosed the property, the quiet solitude of it all. She thought about Henry, his guarded nature, his need for control. But beneath all of that, she was beginning to see glimpses of something else. A man who, perhaps, wasn't as untouchable as he wanted the world to believe. And the realization scared her more than she cared to admit. As the cool night air brushed against her skin, she wondered what would happen if she allowed herself to care. Would she end up regretting it? Or had she already crossed that line without even realizing it? Life has a way of surprising us, often in ways we least expect. Henry and Layla's story reminds us that no matter how much we plan, control, or distance ourselves from emotions, the human heart has a way of finding what it truly needs. For Henry, wealth and success meant nothing without connection. For Layla, hardship taught her resilience, but it was kindness, unexpected and unplanned, that truly changed her life. This story teaches us that meaningful relationships don't always start with love or even understanding. Sometimes, they grow from the simplest acts of care, a thoughtful gesture, a moment of vulnerability, or the willingness to see beyond our first impressions. For those in the later chapters of life, this lesson is even more profound. It's never too late to form new connections, to let people in, and to embrace the unknown. Control may offer security, but it is trust, compassion, and human connection that bring true fulfillment. No matter where life has taken you, there is always room for change, for love, and for finding family in the most unexpected places.